There are places in the woods where you don't get chased, you don't hear screams, and nothing ever jumps out at you. Instead, things feel organized. Trails appear that aren't on any map. Campsites get reset while you sleep. Warning signs face the wrong direction. And by the time you realize something is wrong, you're already exactly where you were never supposed to be. I never planned to go off the trail that day. And that's the part I keep replaying in my head whenever I try to explain what happened. Because if I had chosen to ignore it, if I had just stayed on the marked path like every sign, map, and ranger brochure told me to, then maybe none of this would have followed me home. This happened just outside of Marquette, Michigan, near the edge of Hiawatha National Forest, a place I'd grown up around but never really explored deeply. Not until the year after my father died, when being alone in the woods felt easier than being alone in my own apartment. My dad had been the kind of man who found peace in places without people. And after his heart attack, hiking the trails he used to talk about felt like the closest thing I had to still hearing his voice. So when I took a few days off work in late October and drove north, I told myself it was about clearing my head, about grief, about reconnecting with something simple. But the truth is, I didn't care much what happened to me back then. Not the way you should when you're walking miles into forest with spotty cell service and an early sunset creeping in. The morning I set out was cold but clear, the kind of sharp autumn air that makes every sound carry farther than it should. And I remember thinking how quiet everything felt as I parked near one of the lesser-used trailheads, the gravel crunching under my boots, sounding almost too loud, like the forest was listening. I had a printed trail map folded in my jacket pocket and a GPS app open on my phone, more out of habit than caution. And for the first couple of hours, everything was exactly what it should have been. Narrow dirt paths, fallen leaves, occasional trail markers nailed into trees, the distant sound of wind moving through branches. I walked steadily, letting my thoughts drift, stopping sometimes just to listen, because there was something comforting about knowing I was far enough away from town that no one could reach me easily. That's when I noticed the first thing that didn't quite fit, though I didn't understand it as a warning at the time. The trail marker ahead of me, a faded blue rectangle, wasn't listed on my map. And at first, I assumed I'd missed a recent update or a spur trail added for maintenance access, because that happens more often than people think, especially in large forest systems. But when I checked my phone, the GPS showed nothing branching off in that direction. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring at the marker, feeling a strange tug of curiosity mixed with hesitation. And what pushed me forward wasn't recklessness so much as familiarity, the false confidence of someone who thinks they know a place just because they've lived nearby their whole life. The side trail was narrower than the main one, barely worn into the ground, but it was there, undeniably real, beneath my boots, and the leaves covering it were disturbed in a way that suggested regular foot traffic, not abandoned wilderness. I told myself I'd follow it for a few minutes, just to see where it led, and then turn back, and I even checked my watch, mentally setting a limit, because part of me knew I was crossing an invisible line. As I walked, the forest began to feel subtly different, not in any dramatic way, but in the kind of way that creeps up on you when you're not paying attention. The trees grew closer together, the air felt heavier, and the usual background noise of birds and distant movement faded until my own breathing sounded intrusive. I checked my phone again, expecting at least some signal of where I was. But the GPS dot lagged behind my movements, then froze entirely, spinning as if trying to recalibrate. And I remember laughing under my breath, shaking my head and thinking how unreliable technology always is when you need it most. That was the moment I should have turned around, but instead I kept going, driven by the same quiet insistence that makes people slow down to look at accidents or open doors marked "employees only." The trail curved gently, then sharply, in a way that didn't match the terrain. And when I finally stopped to look back, I realized I couldn't see the way I'd come from, not because of distance, but because the trees behind me had closed in, branches overlapping like they'd always been that way. I felt a flicker of unease then, the kind that tightens your stomach without offering a clear reason. And I told myself it was just the light changing as clouds rolled in, even though the sky above the canopy still looked clear. I continued on, counting my steps, promising myself I'd turn back after 100 more. But the trail kept pulling me forward, always just visible enough to follow. And every time I thought I heard something, a footstep, a shift of weight, it disappeared the moment I stopped walking, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt staged. After what my watch told me was 20 minutes, I came across something that made my heart start pounding for real. A wooden sign posted beside the trail, old but sturdy, with no words on it, just a symbol carved deep into the wood. Something geometric and unfamiliar, like two intersecting shapes that didn't quite line up when you looked at them too long. There was no indication of direction, no warning, no explanation. And the fact that someone had taken the time to carve and post it there unsettled me, more than any obvious danger sign would have. I reached out to touch it, then stopped myself, suddenly aware of how alone I was. And that was when I noticed the ground around the sign was worn down to bare dirt, as if people or something stood there often. I backed away, my instincts finally catching up, and turned to retrace my steps, only to find that the trail behind me looked wrong, narrower than before, uneven, like a rough suggestion of a path rather than the clear line I'd followed in. I walked anyway, faster now, telling myself not to panic, because panic makes you miss obvious solutions. But the farther I went, the less familiar everything became, and soon I realized I was no longer seeing any trail markers at all. My phone buzzed suddenly, making me jump, and for a split second, I felt relief so intense it almost made me dizzy, until I looked down and saw that there was no signal, no message, just the screen lighting up as if something had nudged it awake. That was when I heard my name, spoken softly, not shouted, not whispered, just said in a calm, conversational tone from somewhere off to my right, and every muscle in my body locked up as I stood there, heart hammering, because no one else should have been able to find me. And even if they had, there was no reason they should know who I was. I waited, barely breathing, listening, hoping I'd imagined it. But the forest remained still, offering no confirmation, no denial. And after a long minute, I forced myself to move again, choosing a direction at random, because at that point, all paths felt equally wrong. Time stopped behaving normally after that. Minutes stretched into something thicker, harder to measure, and the light filtering through the trees took on a dull, late afternoon hue that never quite shifted toward evening, as if the sun had stalled overhead. I stumbled into a small clearing where the ground dipped slightly, and in the center stood a stack of stones arranged carefully, deliberately, each one placed with intention. And though I had no cultural reference for what it might represent, I knew instinctively that it wasn't meant for me to see. As I stood there, a wave of sadness washed over me, so sudden and intense it nearly dropped me to my knees. A grief that felt both deeply personal and completely Chuja. And in that moment, I thought of my father, of all the things left unsaid, of the way he used to describe the woods as a place that remembers. And I wondered, with a growing sense of dread, whether that was more literal than I'd ever realized. The thought that followed, that maybe the trail wasn't lost, that maybe it was exactly where it was supposed to be, made my skin crawl. And I backed away from the stones, refusing to let myself linger, because something about them felt like an invitation. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to stop, and when I did, I noticed another sign ahead of me, this one larger, mounted between two trees, and as I approached, my relief faded into something colder, because the sign read, "Restricted Area," plain and official. But it was facing away from me, angled so that anyone coming from the other direction would see it clearly, while I only saw the blank back. I stood there, staring, trying to make sense of it. And that's when I understood that whatever boundary this sign marked, I had crossed it without knowing, without being warned, and the realization sent a spike of fear through me sharper than anything before. I don't remember deciding to run, but suddenly I was moving as fast as I could, branches scraping at my arms, breath burning in my chest, and the trail, or what passed for it, seemed to shift beneath me, curving unexpectedly, forcing me to adjust, as if it were guiding me rather than the other way around. Just when I thought I couldn't go any farther, the trees thinned, and I burst out onto a familiar path, stumbling, nearly falling, the sudden openness almost overwhelming. And when I turned around, the narrow trail I'd followed was gone, replaced by dense undergrowth and unbroken forest floor. I stood there for a long time, shaking, afraid to move, afraid to look away. But nothing happened, and eventually, with the last of my strength, I made my way back to the trailhead, the sun finally dipping low as if time had snapped back into place. I told myself I'd imagined parts of it, that stress and grief had played tricks on me. And for a while, that explanation held. But a week later, back in my apartment, unpacking my gear, I found something in my jacket pocket that I know I didn't put there. A small, smooth stone, warm to the touch, carved with the same symbol I'd seen on the sign deep in the woods. I threw it away immediately, taking it to a dumpster 3 blocks from my building. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, my phone lights up on its own, and for just a second before the screen goes dark again, I swear I see my GPS trying to place me somewhere north of Marquette, in a patch of forest that, according to every map I've checked, doesn't exist. And in those moments, I get the unmistakable feeling that the trail is still there, exactly where it's always been, waiting patiently for me to wander back into it. I didn't even want to go camping that weekend. And that's something I've been honest about from the start, because the decision wasn't mine. Not really. It belonged to a version of me that existed before everything felt so heavy all the time. This happened near the town of Forks, Washington, not far from the edge of Olympic National Forest, a place that already feels cut off from the rest of the world even before you step under the trees. And the only reason I agreed to go was because my younger brother Evan insisted that we needed to get out. That sitting around our apartments, reliving the same conversations about our mom, wasn't helping either of us. She'd passed away earlier that year, unexpectedly, and grief had made Evan restless in a way that scared me, while it made me withdraw. So when he suggested a short camping trip, nothing extreme, just a few nights at a primitive site he'd found online, I told myself that going along with it was the responsible thing to do. The older sibling thing, even though something about the idea made me uneasy from the start. The campsite itself wasn't officially listed, not in the way most national park sites are. But Evan brushed that off, saying it was a known spot locals used, accessible by a service road and a short hike. And when we arrived late in the afternoon, everything looked normal enough. A small clearing surrounded by dense forest, a stone fire ring, a flat patch of ground where tents had clearly been set up many times before. What stood out, even then, was how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind that feels like the absence of something. And I remember thinking that the forest around us felt thick, enclosed, like sound didn't travel far there. We set up camp quickly, daylight already fading, and I tried to focus on practical tasks, pitching the tent, organizing gear, making sure we had enough water, because staying busy kept my mind from drifting back to memories I wasn't ready to deal with yet. That first night passed without incident, or at least without anything obvious, though I didn't sleep well, waking up several times to the sense that something had shifted, that the darkness outside the tent felt different than it had when I closed my eyes. I told myself it was just unfamiliar surroundings, the normal anxiety of sleeping outdoors. And when morning came, pale and gray under a clouded sky, I almost laughed at how tense I'd been. That's when we noticed the first thing that didn't make sense. Our campsite was neat, unnaturally so, like someone had gone through while we slept and tidied up, but not in a way that suggested theft or vandalism. Our boots were lined up side by side near the tent entrance. Even though we'd kicked them off haphazardly the night before, the cooler had been moved closer to the fire ring, and the folding chairs were positioned facing each other, squared off, symmetrical. Evan thought it was funny at first, joking that maybe a park ranger had come through and taken pity on us. But there was no official signage anywhere, no posted rules, and the idea of a ranger entering our campsite in the middle of the night without waking us felt off. I felt that tightness in my stomach again, the same one I'd felt when we arrived, and I walked the perimeter of the clearing, looking for footprints, disturbed leaves, anything that suggested another person had been there. But the ground was hard and covered in old pine needles, giving up nothing. We shrugged it off, because that's what people do when something doesn't fit neatly into their understanding of the world. We minimize it, explain it away, and move on, especially when the alternative is admitting we don't feel safe. We spent the day hiking nearby trails, staying within shouting distance of each other, and for a while, I forgot about the campsite entirely, the physical exertion dulling the edge of my thoughts. When we returned in the late afternoon, though, I noticed something small that I hadn't before. A length of paracord tied between two trees at the edge of the clearing, about chest height, the knot clean and deliberate. Evan swore he hadn't put it there, and I knew I hadn't either. And when I asked him why he'd chosen this site again, really pressed him for details, he admitted that the forum post he'd found it on was old, years old, and the user who'd recommended it hadn't been active since. That second night, I barely slept at all, lying awake, listening to the subtle sounds of the forest, trying to catalog them, to separate the normal from the abnormal. And sometime after midnight, I heard what sounded like movement just beyond the edge of the clearing, slow and careful, followed by a faint clinking noise, like metal touching stone. I held my breath, waiting for Evan to stir, but he slept through it. And eventually, the sounds faded, leaving behind a silence that felt deliberate. Morning brought with it confirmation that we weren't imagining things. The campsite had been reset again, but this time, the changes were more personal. Evan's jacket was folded neatly on his chair. My backpack was zipped closed and placed upright against a tree, and the fire pit had been cleaned out, old ash removed, fresh stones arranged in a precise circle. There were still no footprints, no signs of entry or exit, just the unmistakable impression of intention. Evan stopped joking after that, his unease visible in the way he kept scanning the tree line, his voice dropping whenever he spoke. And when I suggested we pack up and leave, he hesitated, his jaw tightening, admitting quietly that part of the reason he'd wanted to come out here was to feel like someone was still watching over us. That the order, the care, felt comforting, like proof that we weren't as alone as we felt after our mom died. That admission hit me harder than anything else so far, because I realized then how vulnerable we both were, how ready Evan was to see meaning where there might only be danger. And I told him firmly that whatever was happening here wasn't meant to make us feel better. We decided to stay one more night, not because it felt like a good idea, but because leaving in the dark felt worse, and we convinced ourselves that daylight would make everything clearer. That night, we set a small trap of our own, arranging our gear messily on purpose, placing a few lightweight items near the edge of the clearing in a way that would be impossible to reset without leaving some sign. I kept my phone charged, recording audio quietly, hoping to catch something, anything that would prove this was real. Sometime deep into the night, I woke to the unmistakable sound of fabric moving, a soft rustle too close to be wind, and through the thin wall of the tent, I saw shadows shifting where there shouldn't have been any, shapes blocking out the faint starlight, lingering, adjusting. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't call out. I lay there frozen, heart pounding, listening as the sounds continued, careful, methodical, like someone performing a routine they'd practiced many times before. In the morning, the campsite was perfect, more perfect than ever. Our trap erased completely, and the final detail broke whatever denial I had left. Our tent had been rotated slightly, repositioned so that the entrance now faced directly toward the narrow trail leading out of the clearing, as if to show us the way. We didn't argue after that. We packed up in silence, our movements rushed and clumsy. And as we shouldered our packs, I noticed something carved into the tree beside the paracord. A simple symbol I didn't recognize, worn smooth as if it had been there a long time. We left quickly, not stopping until we reached the road. And even then, I didn't feel relief so much as a dull, lingering dread. Back home, life slowly returned to something resembling normal. But every now and then, Evan would text me late at night, asking if I'd moved anything in his apartment when I'd visited, asking if I remembered where we'd put certain things, because he kept finding them arranged differently than he'd left them. Neat, intentional, familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. I tell him it's probably stress, probably habit, because I don't know what else to say. But sometimes, when I wake up and see my shoes lined up neatly by the door, toes pointed outward, ready to leave. I can't shake the feeling that whatever reset our campsite didn't stop when we did, that it learned us, and that it's still watching, still organizing, still making sure everything is exactly where it thinks it should be. The first thing you need to understand is that I didn't ignore the warning sign on purpose, because at the moment I crossed the boundary, I genuinely didn't know it was there. And that detail is what still keeps me awake some nights. Replaying the memory again and again, trying to pinpoint the exact second when things stopped being normal. This happened near the town of Bishop, California, on the eastern edge of the Sierra Nevada, an area I'd visited countless times growing up, a place defined by wide open spaces, dry air, and the kind of quiet that feels honest rather than threatening. At least until you step far enough away from the road. I was there alone in early November, not for adventure, not for thrill-seeking, but because I'd reached a point in my life where being anywhere familiar felt unbearable. My marriage had ended earlier that year, quietly, painfully, without the dramatic blow-ups people expect, and I found myself craving distance more than comfort. So I took a few days off work, loaded my truck with basic camping gear, and headed toward a stretch of land just south of the Inyo National Forest boundary, a place I'd marked on my map as empty, undeveloped, and most importantly, quiet. The dirt road leading out there was rough but passable, and as I drove, cell service dropped away gradually, bar by bar, until the screen went dark, which I found oddly reassuring at the time. I parked near a dry wash as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the scrubland, and shouldered my pack, planning to hike just a couple of miles in before setting up camp. Everything felt ordinary at first. The crunch of gravel under my boots, the faint smell of dust and sage, the distant outline of mountains fading into dusk. I followed what looked like a faint trail, not officially marked, but clearly used, likely by hikers or hunters cutting through the area, and I remember noting how natural it felt, how it curved gently around rocks and low brush, guiding me forward without effort. There were no signs warning me away, no fences, nothing to suggest I wasn't supposed to be there, and that absence mattered more than I realized at the time. I set up camp just before dark, a simple one-person tent tucked against a cluster of boulders that blocked the wind, and as night fell, the temperature dropped sharply, the kind of cold that creeps into your bones if you're not paying attention. I cooked a quick meal, sat by a small fire, and let myself feel the exhaustion I'd been carrying for months finally catch up with me. Sleep came easily, heavy and dreamless, and when I woke the next morning, the world looked unchanged, bathed in pale desert light, silent except for the occasional whisper of wind. That's when I noticed the sign. It stood about 20 yards from my campsite, mounted on 2 metal posts, driven into the hard ground, weathered but sturdy, with bold black letters that read, "Restricted Area, No Entry." Plain and unmistakable, except for one detail that made my stomach drop when I really looked at it. The sign was facing away from me. The blank metal back was what greeted anyone approaching from my side, while the warning itself faced deeper into the land, visible only to someone already inside. I stood there for a long moment, trying to process what that meant, because signs don't get installed like that by accident. And even if they did, someone would have noticed, would have fixed it, especially in an area that saw occasional use. I walked around it slowly, checking for other markers, fencing, anything that might clarify the boundary I'd apparently crossed without knowing. But there was nothing else. just open land, stretching out in every direction. Logic told me the simplest explanation was vandalism, or maybe an old sign rotated by the wind. But the posts were firmly anchored, the bolts tight, the placement deliberate. A quiet unease settled over me then, subtle but persistent, and I decided the smart thing to do was pack up and move on, not wanting to risk trouble or fines. But as I started breaking down camp, I realized something else was wrong. My footprints from the night before, the clear tracks leading from the trail to my campsite, were gone, smoothed over, as if the ground had never been disturbed. I told myself the wind had done it, that the desert can erase things quickly, but the explanation felt thin even as I thought it. I left anyway, choosing a direction that should have taken me back toward the road, keeping the sun at my shoulder the way I'd been taught. But after what felt like an hour of steady walking, the landscape began to repeat itself in unsettling ways. The same rock formations, the same clusters of brush, subtle landmarks reappearing just out of sync, like copies rather than the originals. I checked my GPS, expecting reassurance, only to find it spinning uselessly, unable to lock onto anything. And when it finally did display coordinates, they placed me several miles north of where I knew I was, deep inside an area marked on my offline map as restricted, unmarked, blank. That was the first time I felt real fear. The kind that tightens your chest and sharpens your thoughts. And I turned back, determined to retrace my steps, only to realize I couldn't find the sign again, no matter which direction I walked. Hours passed like that, the sun climbing, then stalling in the sky, the light harsh and unchanging, and the quiet grew heavier, pressing in until even my own breathing sounded wrong, too loud, too noticeable. Eventually, I came across another sign, identical to the first, same wording, same weathered metal. And for a split second, relief flooded me until I saw that this one, too, was facing the wrong way. Its warning turned inward, hidden from anyone approaching from outside. I stood there, heart pounding, and a thought crept into my mind that I didn't want to acknowledge. That these signs weren't meant to keep people out. They were meant to tell something else where it was allowed to go. The idea followed me as I moved, refusing to settle, and with it came the growing sense that I was being subtly guided, not chased, not threatened, just nudged along invisible lines I couldn't see. Late in the afternoon, exhausted and disoriented, I stumbled onto a narrow service road I recognized instantly, and the relief was so intense it nearly dropped me to my knees. I followed it back to my truck, hands shaking as I unlocked the door. And when I finally drove away, watching the land recede in the rearview mirror, I promised myself I wouldn't think about it again, that I'd chalk it up to stress, dehydration, bad judgment. For a while, that worked. Weeks passed, then months, and life slowly settled into a new, quieter routine. But every now and then, driving home late at night, I'd catch sight of roadside signs in my headlights and feel a spike of anxiety when I noticed how many of them only made sense from one direction. The final detail, the one that convinced me this wasn't just my imagination, came almost a year later when I was visiting a friend outside town and took a wrong turn down a rural road I'd never driven before. As I slowed to turn around, my headlights swept across a familiar shape, and there, standing just beyond the shoulder, was a weathered metal sign on two posts, its warning message facing away from me, turned carefully toward the darkness beyond, as if waiting for something to notice it. And in that moment, I felt the same cold certainty I'd felt in the desert, the understanding that the boundary hadn't been left behind. that it wasn't fixed to one place, and that sometimes the signs aren't meant to warn you at all, but to let you know, far too late, which side you've already chosen.